Okay, Europa Universalis, price of power. Tilted it away so you can't see the box quite as well. I can slide it closer. Alright. So, this has been, I think, my longest in terms of total time spent on video playthrough series. Which is odd because it's not the longest game I've played. But between my loneliness and desire to chat more than usual, and most importantly, the fact that this is the biggest Euro game, or Woro, whatever you want to call it, that I've dealt with, that maybe exists, I think it's kind of a requirement. So the thing is, with Euros and things that are closely aligned with them, it's very hard to capture the big picture. You can't step back and say, okay, on this turn, I did all this stuff, and point out, you know, sort of the major operations that you performed, whatever. Instead, you're pulsing, and honestly, CDGs have the same issue, and I would consider them somewhat Euro informed in terms of their design, as are some of the more pulsed games from way back in the 80s by Victory Games and whatnot. And yeah, if I had paid serious attention to like trying to detail all the operations in, say, Vietnam, that would have been a humongous set of videos. Instead, what it was I kind of did some hand waving, hey, did some stuff over here. Because, well, in that game, most of the operations are, it's mostly the U.S. doing a bunch of stuff, and trying, you know, which means since one person is being sort of the initiative player at any given time, during an offensive, it's possible that the VC NVA player has initiative, and during parts of certain turns they may. But for the most part, it's like you can zoom in and say, you know, I spent a lot of time over here in I-Core, and I did, you know, very little, which is usually what that game does. But in these more pulsed games, with the CDGs, with regular Euros, it's usually so important to look into sort of the totality of the action, because that's all there is. You could step back to 1,000 yards and give some reports, right? Like, looks like Red's got a lot of victory points this turn, and they did some things. They built some of this and whatever. And you could give a summation over the course of, you know, what an entire turn is. But there's no sort of middle ground where you're giving a fair amount of detail on what's going on without really zooming in and looking at the card per card play in the CDG, or hear the action by action pick. And the same goes with the coin games, whatever. A lot of these more modern, more interleaved operation games. So that explains why it took so damn long. It did not help that I did a lot of rules lookups, and I did a lot of them online. One of the reasons for that is I believe that kind of showing the difficulty in holding onto the whole set of rules is an important aspect of a game like this. And when you have to interrupt all that pulsing to look things up consistently, that's particularly problematic. So like rules lookups, and I would do these in other bigger games as well. But where they come, and then you don't have to look them up consistently. You kind of remember and you kind of get the pacing. Here I found myself having to look them up quite a bit, having to look things up because the Euro nature, the abstractions involved in this game, took a lot of the sort of hooks that make it easier for me to remember how something works out of my hands. Now, yeah, I'm going to say the same thing kind of happens with the CDGs. It happens with the coin games sometimes, where you're having to look stuff up consistently. It happens with Axis Empires, where you're doing small operations, but they're sort of, because some of the rules are presented on cards and whatnot, figuring out how they integrate with the actual rule book is kind of a pain. And the rule book is mighty, especially if you count all of the rule books that are involved. You have a normal rule book, you have a set of rules for the solo and bot play, and yeah, it supports solo play. You have 2 scenario books. You probably don't have to look in these very often. When you set the game up and when you set the decks up, you're going to have to look at them. You also have a whole bunch of player aids, most of which are, 1 per player. They contain, the main thing I use this one for is the cost of the actions. Also has a sequence of play on it, cost of military units. Event symbols. This would have been helpful. I kept looking in the rule book for these. I don't know if this is not as significant, and these are things where they happen rarely enough that you probably can't just go by the cheat sheet unless you have a much, much better memory than I have. On the other side, we have a number of things that have to do with battle. I actually found a fair amount of this, like the actual handling of the battles and whatnot, to be easy to remember. It wasn't the kind of stuff that I had to look up consistently. The other stuff I did feel like, again, the information here is maybe a good reminder if you've played the game several times. But I spent a lot of time playing this, and I don't feel like this, again, like the event summary, would be sufficient for me to operate without having to look in the rules consistently for these kind of odder situations. Got this whole flowchart thing. I never used it. Might have been a good idea. I can't tell you. I usually try to avoid these things, but whatever. This gives you a list of all the nations, well, all the province alignments or whatever. Yeah, I guess they're nations. I don't know. More of the player aids. Yeah, that's it. The expanded game gives you nations from the Eastern European map over here and where they're centered. That doesn't necessarily tell you every province that they own at the beginning of a given scenario, and it can actually change because, oh, now I'm curious. Yeah, okay. Because each map, is this the Western? Yeah. Each map is double-sided. So I started the Grand Campaign in 1444, but let's flip this to here. There is also a 1618 setup. And those are sort of the base starting dates for the game. You can start at other dates. The game gives some information about what changes would be in play for some of those other dates, I think. I'm not positive, actually, of that. I say, let's take a look at the scenarios. So 1444, 1444, 1444, 1492. So this is going to have slightly different setups for the players. It probably has all the NPCs in the same places that they would be. 1511, again, not one of those dates. And again, it has a set of where things are set up. And if need be, it might have additional NPR, non-player realms on the map. And while we're starting to talk about components, let's talk about, we talked a little bit about the player aids, about the rules themselves. They are presented, oddly enough, perhaps, or not oddly, in a very Euro fashion, very modern fashion. Glossy paper, lots of pictures. Okay, you know, if you know my views on these, you know that already has me somewhat disturbed. But it also is written in a way that feels very similar to a Euro game. So you open up, yeah, you got some definition of terms, which feels more wargaming. But you have a picture of the map and components and numbered positioning telling you what everything is, and then another such picture. And then you get into the rules proper, and even the rules proper, while they have a fair amount of cross-referencing and numbering, and they actually do some good jobs with this in terms of like telling you what page to go to for something, and there is also a relatively decent index in the back. I didn't find a lot of things that were absolutely ambiguous. Let's try to pronounce that a little oddly. However, there were things you really kind of had to struggle with and balance competing rules with to understand how they actually operated. Some of that may be an attempt at a more parsimonious explanation, but there aren't a lot of examples, and there are some really odd things that intuitively you wouldn't accept. Now I faced that same thing with, what is it, Time of Wars or whatever, the Eastern European version of Here I Stand, basically, that I did more recently, or relatively recently. This is nowhere near as troublesome as that. That has things where you're just like, I can't believe that's how this works. This has things where it's hard to believe it's how it works, but there's so much abstraction that you're kind of like, yeah, okay. The map itself, I found a little too cluttered. Once you get all the pieces on it and everything, it was a little problematic that way. It's also a hard board, and I think that's probably the case for both versions, because printing different maps, you know, is a little weird. But it would be possible to do a paper map, I guess. The hard board, you know, you can have your pluses and minuses for it. It's a really beautiful map. What I found was, because the game has so much of a footprint, I had to put tables together that aren't necessarily the same size. Now, everybody's not going to have this problem, but I ended up with kind of a separation between parts of the hard map that was obnoxious, right? And a paper map wouldn't do that unless you put the paper map right in the wrong place. And I kind of had this right in the wrong place anyway, so don't worry too much about that. You have a ton of cards, and I've got them set in this inset here. They're your standard kind of good quality poker cards that games put out these days. It's a wonderful thing. You got these littler cards that represent a bunch of different pieces of information, stuff that you're aiming for, either personally or more broadly that you are. Ideas, which are sort of your tech tree in this, but they don't feel too tree-like. Events, which are going to, a lot of them are very historical and are linked to the countries that you play in the game. Those events are going to kind of drive a lot of the play of the game, as are these power struggles, maybe some of the milestones and goals that you have out there. You have a deck of trade cards, which have a kind of clever little mechanism for them. I don't really like how it works out. You have these cards, which are, I thought these would be more important than they are in terms of the activities that they allow, but they're basically action cards that you're going to be able to pay to use. You can pay essentially political power from your monarch to affect them, and that's a cost that's related up here. As opposed to like a CDG where the number up there is like what you get. Nah, the number up there is what you pay in terms of cubes. We'll get to cubes. Or you can pay cash in a lot of cases. Well, this one's a monarch. You can play him as a monarch. Or you can pay a cube to use him militarily. But some of them, many of them, look like this. And they have a cost. And they will produce more cubes for you. Cubes are a really important thing in the game. You have player setup cards, and you have a bunch of dice. Some of these are used for combat, some of them are used for rebellions, exploration, the bot, whatever. Excuse me. In general, the components across the board are really top-notch, at least in this. What are we doing? Trying to get a crotch shot or something? In this deluxe edition that I have. The one thing that I think may be different, so the deluxe edition comes with an expansion, which is the Eastern European map. I've got kind of mixed feelings about this. Obviously, you can't be playing Europa Universalis without the whole world, right? I mean, however, I think the game was more designed in terms of using the Western map and using the rest of the world map. And the reason I say that is there are only 6 player power sets in the game. And they come in these nice little trays. We'll look at what they are. They're little wooden pieces for the most part. There are some cardboard pieces. You got merchants. You got a little cylinder for tracking some information in a couple of places. You got armies. You got little boats. You got things to represent towns, and there's bigger ones elsewhere. You got some counters, which will represent marriages and alliances, claims to area, core areas that have accepted that you're the overlord when you weren't that originally. Got little discs for vassals as well. You have markers to indicate who you're at war with, who you have truces with, who you have a casus belli against. Many of these are limited by the counter mix in the rules, and that's something problematic that I need to get to at some point. You also have 3 little army counters, which seems to be sufficient, and 1 fleet counter, which doesn't seem to be sufficient. Okay. Once you get to the mid-17th century, I feel like the military handling of the game, mid-18th century, call it, maybe even early 18th. But the military handling of the game starts to become more and more problematic. And that's because armies tended to be able to make bigger, more sweeping campaigns, and that's very difficult in this game. And what the game does, as far as I can tell, is it abstracts that away. So the Napoleonic Wars could be all fought in, essentially Westphalia, Saxony, central Germany, right? And that has to represent everything, including the war with Russia and whatever. It's very disturbing. And some of that has to do with the fact that the game has like these turns that are about 20 years each. I call them turns. They're called rounds in the game itself. And the number of military operations that you can undertake is limited by your cube supply. Cubes are very, very limited. Okay? You basically, what I found was you have enough cubes to keep your country from going into the shitter if you work really hard. And maybe doing a little bit more. But if you're going to engage in exploration and colonization of the New World, if you're going to involve yourself in any wars, you're going to find you really can't do much on that level and still keep your country from collapsing completely. And if you have a lousy leader, if you don't have any advisors, you're not going to have enough cubes to be able to even keep your country stable. In terms of accuracy and realism, some of that I buy, some of it I don't. Because you're actually given a choice between, do you want to pursue war aims, which some of the cards, etc., give you good reasons to do, or do you want to keep your country stable and prosperous, right? Do you want to explore the New World? Do you want to, involve yourself throughout the distant continents? Or do you want to keep your country stable and prosperous? In general, you're able, as long as you don't get fucked too badly in terms of leader-advisor combination, to keep your country stable, even in the face of like religious problems and everything else. If you work completely at that, you can do so. Is that believable? I don't know. That's where I have kind of a problem. It feels to me like you shouldn't really be able to just guarantee that everything will go okay as long as you don't do anything else. It's also incredibly ahistorical because countries were engaging in wars and exploration and, improving their economy and trade and all this other stuff that in this game, if you do so, you end up running out of operations that you can do, and therefore you can't keep yourself stable. Or you could say you could engage in very limited war. The game also has and we'll get to more details as we go. I didn't show these. So each player has one of these, which, whoa, there's two of these. Oh, this is very interesting. So this is the player side. This, I think, is the bot side, which doesn't have depressions. There's little depressions to hold your wooden things in. This would actually be very helpful if there were counters for the bots. And I'll explain that when I talk about some other stuff. For the most part, this is to support the bots, and it's just a different design. For the most part, your counter mix, you don't get counters for your countries. You get the wooden pieces, which are beautiful and everything. I don't know how I feel about them. Like, sometimes there's a mixture of wooden pieces and counters on the board, and I feel like the board may be a little too crowded for the wooden pieces. where counters might have worked better because they can kind of overlap a little easier. I don't know. There's a certain emphasis, though, where the wooden pieces help you see which towns you have. Anyway, so you have this really nice map for the player that is, I mean, it's thick cardboard, it's got depressions to put things in, feels very much like a highly produced Euro. But then you've got these kind of thin stock things that you hold your armies and navies on. What I was looking for was this, which is again thin stock, one-sided. This holds a couple of pieces of information on it. Holds information about the papal curia, how many cardinals you have, etc., and whoever owns the curia gets some bonus. Holds some information about the imperial authority. The Holy Roman Emperor is able to get some benefits, the better he can do, and all kinds of benefits. Victory points, troops, extra cubes. There's a space here that holds the current power struggle. We may talk about power struggles in a bit. I don't know if we're going to go into that much detail. We'll see. We'll see how much, because this is going to be a long-ass fucking video too, if we're not careful. But what I wanted to get to was this, the round status. The way this operates is each player starts their round up here, in this slot. If they play an event, and you must choose one event to play every turn, they're available for everyone to pick. There's some monetary incentive to picking ones that other people haven't picked. Some of them are bad, but they might be to your advantage to pick, right? Some of them are national. You don't really want someone else choosing your national ones, but there's not much you can do to stop that except grab it when it comes out if your turn is in the right order, and you hope nobody cares enough to grab it before you. Anyway, once you do an event, you get pushed into here, and now you're eligible to pass. Once enough people pass, and in the game I was playing, that's 4 out of 6. There's one more turn, one more set of player turns. Each player who's still active gets one more turn. If they have an event that they haven't played yet, they don't have to use it on that turn. They'll get another free turn after that to play their event, if they wish to do that. But what this means is the person with the, a person who has a lot of cubes, has a lot of power, a lot of administrative a lot of political capability to do various things. However, they're limited by the number of players who are smaller, who have a smaller cube supply than they do, who wish to pass or whatever. And this creates some really weird, gamey, artificial situations where someone can end the turn on someone else and basically take away their political power. Yeah, they get to keep it between turns, but it removes it from their hands. Okay. That's kind of a brief look at some of the mechanisms that are in play. I'm going to dive in, I did it through the components, whatever. I'm going to dive in a little bit more deeply by looking at the rule book itself, working my way through various rules, and coming up with, in general, what are going to be criticisms. To be fair, right, this is what I always do. I look for what doesn't work, because it's easier to see what doesn't work, what doesn't feel right, what doesn't please you. There are very, very few things that, I look at and I say, oh, this is just brilliant. I'll point them out when I see them, but that is the rarity. So just be used to that. My reviews come out sounding ultimately more negative than they necessarily are. I have very mixed feelings on this game, and I'll give you the hint on that right now, and then we'll go into it, as we look at the rules more and more. I was very excited to begin with. I love Europa Universalis. I love the original board game. It's one of my top games of all time. I loved the computer game, although I'm having trouble playing it effectively now. Like, it caught me up before, but now I just don't have the attention to put into it. And I really only played the first two versions of it very heavily. I've fiddled around with up to like version 4, I think, and just wasn't able to get excited by it. Versions 3 and 4 are closer to what this game is representing. Judging this game as to how well it handles either the original game, the first couple versions of the computer game, or later versions of the computer game, I feel like it falls short in several places. The one thing that it really gets right, though, is you've got this massive scope that you're handling, and you're dealing with, running a country throughout the course of, several hundred years, and of a very, very impactful period of history, one that technology is changing significantly during it, and the shape of the world is changing, essentially, right? However, it feels like the mechanisms that were put in place. So the original computer game version was an attempt to take the original board game and say, how can we put all the detail we really wanted to put into the board game and, make it work by using NPCs all over the place running stuff? Look, that's just not going to work in a board game, right? But that was what originally was done in the computer game, was a lot more detail was put in. Also, unfortunately, it was put into this real-time strategy format, which kind of meant that, I don't know, you end up, it's okay when you're playing solo. I can't imagine playing EU opposed because of the RTS functionality in it. You're just balancing too many things. It really is, the original game was turn-based, and I think the computer game should have stayed that way. But anyway, I didn't like that part of it. This absolutely fails to be an RTS, right? The closest it comes to it is by having this kind of interleaving of actions, but that doesn't particularly feel like the computer game. It feels closer to the original board game in that sense. But in a weird sort of way. From what I remember of the computer game, in its various formats, yes, you had limitations on what you could do. But those limitations, like, you weren't prevented from going to war because you wanted to deal with unrest in your country. Now, I may be wrong about this. Certainly in the board game and the computer game, you don't want to go to war if you have a lot of unrest in your country. But the unrest seems to flow a little more heavily and a little more consistently in this game. And you have to deal with it every turn. You really have to. It's not something that sparks up by some events or something where it's a minor facet that hits you, which is what it feels like, certainly in the original board game and in the earlier versions of the computer game. Here you have a consistent undertow of unrest happening that you have to spend cubes to deal with, and if you don't, you're in hell, right? And if you have any religious dissent in your country, it's going to be very problematic. I gotta swap batteries. The way I look at it is this game provides you with capability to deal with your unrest all the time. If you don't deal with it all the time, you're in trouble. And What's missing is what I'm going to call the fat. Your country doesn't have enough fat in terms of action, in terms of these cubes, to be able to perform as many actions as it should. Well, as many actions as it did historically, while still struggling with unrest, and maybe not curing the unrest, but struggling with it, right? And what I found with that was you just weren't able to do enough in this game. Now, maybe that's me not playing it well enough. I do have to tell you, early on in my playing, I definitely did not understand how important advisors were, how unimportant money was in comparison to them. And my battery is playing games with me. But once I got to a certain point in the game, I was certainly having more issues than I felt I should, and was unable to conduct, operations as much as I would like to. Other big things that really kind of got to me. All right. One, the number of components for players and the scenarios for players. I feel like the Eastern map, adding the Eastern map to the Grand Campaign, doesn't really work. You actually have to cut part of the Eastern map out and not play with Russia. It becomes, it just trims some of the map. Your other options are to leave Austria out of the game as a major power. I feel like the game would do much better with enough counter mixes for 2 more players and scenarios to handle those players. Some of those players might change country, a la the original board game. You don't do this in the computer game. Well, I'm not sure. I think you're actually allowed to. Certainly if you're playing solo, you can swap. You can set it up and change which country you're playing. I don't know what that does to your victory points and whatnot, but if you're like, wow, they're doing really well, I want to be them, or I proved my point with this country, let's go see what's going on over here and play this country for a while. Some kind of mechanism that allows you to swap into a different country would be really helpful. In order to do that properly, you might need to pre-program everything like you do in the original EU board game, which says, here's a starting point and time for this country. You stop being this country and you become this one, and your victory points track along with it. That's going to be hard to do because there's final victory points in this, which I don't know. There's sort of final victory points for your final game state, which feels kind of weird. Now, if you get wiped out, or if your country is really in bad shape, I can see wanting to swap into a different country. But there's basically victory points from 2 things. There's victory points that you collect up over the course of the game. That's going to be the majority of your points. A little thing here. But your well, it may not even be. I've got people who their final game state points was not far from what their tax value was, and their total end game victory points probably comes kind of close, except that they had negatives. But if you're doing well, your game state, the game glory points, I'm going to call them. They're for getting ideas, fulfilling missions, stuff like that. You should have a pretty good pile of those over the course of the game. And for the people who actually did well in the game, we're talking about, at least 2 to 1. The people who didn't do well got about even in terms of the glory points that they were able to accumulate. And that's really a matter of, if you don't get your missions accomplished, other missions aren't open to you. And there's a bunch of generic missions. There may be some mechanism you could use to play with that. One of the things that I wanted to do was to try to fiddle with the game. I could maybe make pieces to play an extra couple powers. I could, shit. My damn battery keeps running, it doesn't work right. And the charger. And I'm sitting here and I'm seeing it, changing colors, and can't stand that because I know I'm going to need a decent amount of video. Anyway, that was one of the things I wanted to tinker with. There were other things I wanted to tinker with. So for example, the event deck that you're facing in any given scenario is a fixed deck, okay? There are suggestions of how you could mod that deck, but kind of the expectation is whatever deck you put into the game, all the players should know it. That's sort of the opposite of what I like in a game. The original EU had events, and certainly this became more and more with the newer versions, events that were really kind of random. There were game-changing events that had to be put in. Now, just because an event's in the game doesn't mean that it takes effect. So something like the Council of Trent didn't take effect in my playthrough. So yeah, one of the things that's missing is there just aren't enough player sets, and there aren't quite the rules to support the powers that you'd want in the game. And I would say probably at the beginning of the game it would make sense to put Russia in for sure. They basically have rules for it, but you replace Austria with Russia, and that's not going to really work either. Or you don't create a dead zone for Austria, but it might sort of be one. And I'd also probably suggest putting Denmark in, presuming that the Denmark-Sweden, a set of two countries that actually I think do kind of hand off one to the other within the set for the game. There are other possibilities, though, that come to mind. Portugal is one that, wow, you really kind of want Portugal in the game. And this is where I've got this, you probably want countries to switch from one to the other. Just like in the original Europa Universalis board game, you play Portugal for two eras, and then you switch to Russia. But you'd have to have, like, the Russia setup for that period, to say, hey, Russia did this. There's also the problem that with Poland as a player, can you really have Russia not in the game? Is that fair? Should they be allowed, to kind of grow as they are? Another big thing that I really didn't like, well, I've talked about the cubes plenty already. I'll go into more detail on them. But they're this thing that I can't understand what it represents. They're a limited countermix item that represents political power. It represents diplomatic influence. It represents institution power that you put into certain institutions. It represents towns that you no longer control that you have on the board. It represents a whole bunch of things, and it's very hard for me to wrap my head around why it's a limited commodity, honestly, among other things. There are other things that are limited commodities that are really problematic, like markers to indicate what religion something is, which have all kind of perverse factors that come around into them. You could flip over. You can flip over a. Fuck it. I'm just going to do this as one video, and I'm not going to go into the rules into detail. So, Protestant and Counter-Reform Catholic are on opposite sides of the same chip. If all the chips that are Protestant, Counter-Reformed, Catholic are already on the board, and you want to change something to either Protestant or Counter-Reformed Catholic, and it's not the other. If it's the other, you just flip it. You take that religion off someplace else, reverting it to its original religion on the board, and place yours where you go. Now that has some interesting effects with the revolutionary ideology. But other than that, it absolutely disturbs me, and even with the revolutionary ideology, I don't really buy it. Similarly, you might have claim to an area and get a temporary casus belli, casus bellum, against an area, and then because they're back printed on each other, you have to remove the the claim that you had somewhere to put the casus bellum, which is kind of a negative thing. Having a casus bellum is not necessarily a good thing. You pay a price for not declaring war where you're directed to get one of these by whatever means. Rebel forces and national forces from non-player areas use a combined counter set that is not an that is limited to the countermix size. Well, what this means is that I could build troops, among other things. I could build allied troops and remove rebels from territory that I don't want rebels to be in. Or if I get rebels, I can move them from my area. Like if I get rebels generated by an event or something, I can remove them from my area and move them to someplace else. If there are enough rebels on the map and NPR troops, allied troops on the map, again, it's like there's this desire to make the game fit the counter mix and rules that you can maybe make some hand-wavy type arguments about that make it work. You know, that give you some explanation for it, some kind of cover for the way the rules actually do work, but it feels like an abomination to me. It feels so absolutely incorrect. Another thing that I found that was difficult was there are tableaus of cards. The ideas and the generic missions, well, not generic, the age milestones, not missions, the era-specific milestones that have to be somewhere, and also the events for a given, for the given turn. They have to be face up somewhere. The game has a big footprint. Even with me playing solo, I wasn't finding it easy to access all the information that the game was providing. And that is kind of a problematic situation. I've already talked about briefly before, and I'm probably not going to go into too much detail, but warfare is exceedingly abstracted. The only way you can make sense of some of these major conflicts is to say that there's a whole bunch going on that the game isn't showing you. Now, this may not be a big deal. I would guess that anyone with historical knowledge is going to be somewhat upset by how much it's abstracted away. Like that the entirety of the Napoleonic Wars might happen, in a couple of battles, in a couple of provinces. Like if you were doing the historical, a couple of provinces somewhere between France and Germany, somewhere in that general area. The whole thing, maybe a couple of battles, maybe 2 or 3 battles, maybe a couple of sieges. That would be it. all she wrote. You would not be covering this widespread invasion of Russia or whatever. Just isn't going to happen. There are not enough cubes for that to work. We may have to go into cubes in more detail if I'm going to do this and not really work my way through the rules. The fact that you only have one fleet in the game. You can have light ships operating, kind of like fleets. They can fight battles, etc. Those are your frigates and whatever. But when you put heavy ships or galleys, you can only have one fleet that contains either of those. This is particularly problematic if you're looking, like, I think 2 fleets would be enough for the game, just like I think the 3 armies that are in the game are enough. You can only have infantry on the board, but you can have artillery and cavalry in armies. You can only have an admiral or a general in an army or a navy, vice versa. But those limitations, while they feel somewhat disturbing, while the fact that every country has exactly the same limitation there, although the actual size of the army is based on better mechanisms than the original board game had. The original board game basically took and said, oh, well, you're in the medieval era, or you're in the first era of the game. Okay, here are the armies for the different countries. Here's their max size. So like Louis XIV, no matter how badly France was doing, would have armies that could hold a huge amount of forces. Whereas a country that had gone into decline historically might not have as big an army available to them. For the most part, though, the armies just grew in size to indicate the fact that armies were, actually getting larger. But something like the Ottoman have like an ability to reform their army into a more modern army, and they don't get like a boost in army size, which they should. These are little things that are trims around the edges in the original game that you could play around with. Here, your army size is basically how many little military guys you have, which is based on how many towns and vassals you have. There are modifiers to it, and it always grows. And it actually works better than the original. It's one of the few places where I think this game gets the historical aspects better. Why are cubes a problem as a mechanism? I went over this so many times in the video. First of all, they're representing a lot of different things. The way they interact with this turn thing, with the fact that if someone passes, you can no longer declare war on them. If you're already at war with them, you can prosecute a war against them, which sucks to be them. But yeah, so somebody's able to shut you down by just passing. You can't affect them anymore with a war. You can't create a war on them. Or if 4 players had done everything that they wanted to out of the 6, they're able to shut you down to, you can't do anything else, period, the end, no matter how vital how vibrant your king is, right? There was something like that in the original game, sort of, but it didn't affect everything. And what affects everything here is that there's been this interleaving of all the things that you want to do, handling unrest, playing around with diplomacy, the economics, all of that is interleaved in actions with what could be the military here. In the original game, there was a strict distinction. You had a spreadsheet phase, basically. When you sat down and you figured out what your country's main goals were for this turn, and you expended money and plotted out what you were doing, and rolled dice for it, took the effects, this was more than half the game was this spreadsheet phase. Now, I understand some people who like Euros would hate this, right? This is absolutely the antithesis of the Euro sort of style of game, where everybody's working on their own on their little spreadsheet and then, rolling some dice, figuring it out. And then you came to what was really the military rounds. And those were focused on two things. You could only do two things in them, basically. You could move your armies around and engage in military operations, including putting down unrest. Costs you money. And you could do exploration. And for the most part, each of them ran pretty quickly. As a whole, they were the most military part of the game. Probably couldn't represent the Napoleonic Wars in them either. Turns in the original game were only 5 years each instead of about 20. However, so it would have been over 3 turns to do the whole Napoleonic Wars. Truth of the matter is, the original game ended in 1796, I think. I don't know what it ended in, but it ends before the proper Napoleonic Wars happen. It ends in a period when you would be having the Revolutionary Wars. Much better place to end if you can't resolve that kind of situation, right? Because it's really those huge sweeping movements across the continent, those did not happen in any of these other eras, right? So something significant changes, but this game takes you to 1821. It takes you past the Napoleonic Wars, and that is where it is the most egregious. It is plausible to kind of buy the much more limited warfare. I mean, if you look at like the 7 Years' War, hey, most of that happened like in Silesia, Saxony, Bohemia, just little bits of fighting. If there were only a couple of battles that were represented over the course of a 20-year period, sure, maybe it happened that way. Maybe you can believe that. It's the Napoleonic Wars that are the most devastating to see what happens. Other places, the areas are big enough, so like, if you have the French, the Italian Wars, the French army marches into Italy, North Italy, maybe into Central Italy, and gets forced back. That could happen. That could happen in the game. It feels like more happened in the 7 Years' War itself than happens in the period that contains kind of both it and the Austrian succession, although they're kind of split in decks, I think, which is really kind of weird, but so they could happen very, very distinct from each other. Anyway, the military abstraction is very, very disturbing. The use of the cubes is so weird. The countermix limitations on cubes are problematic, but also on some of the other items. Trade. Trade is not very much like it's presented in either the board game or the computer game, the earlier board game or the computer game. In the early board game, the way trade worked is it's one of these investments. It's like colonial investments. You do it in your spreadsheet phase, it shows up, and you collect an income from it. And you collect a consistent income from whatever you have on the board. It might go up and down based on values of commodities. It might go up and down based on commodities or something different. But they're what's used here. It might go up and down based on your merchants being affected by pirates, by competition, etc. Trade here is handled. You have to pay some cubes to do it. This is something that didn't really cost you anything. It cost you to set up trade routes, right? But once they were in place, they just generated income. And you had a limitation to how much trade you could do. Didn't affect your diplomacy. Here it's based on your diplomacy cubes. You get these cards. You draw 3 of them. They have a resource. They list three areas, three trade zones that you might be effective in, and you move your merchant to one of those trade zones that you're eligible to use, you count up your points, and you get cash. Basically what happened, and if you can't get better in anywhere else, you can take $2 for your trade card. But the fact that it's eating up a resource that's really important, your cube, right? As well as one of your actions, right? It means that you're doing something, you're expending something rather major to just collect your income. Now, regular taxation doesn't work that way in this game. You don't have to expend cubes to get your taxation. If anything, it probably costs the administrative state more to tax internal resources than it does to provide, an import duty or something along those lines. Also, in the original game and in the computer game, I don't believe the idea is that this is the revenue of the state that you're sitting here with cash. It is the revenue available that the state's expanding in. So, in some cases, the state gave a patent to form a colony and washed its hands of it. It didn't send money. It didn't send anything. Trade was often done by simply people out there trading. So the money that was present in earlier versions of the game represented more the overall effort of the nation rather than the nation state saying, let's devote some of our tax income to this. Let's devote some of our tax income to that. So the idea that the monarch would have to expend an effort to promote trade is somewhat disturbing. The effect of it was that only England really worried about trade. Only England worried about piracy. Other countries sometimes would draw for trade because, hey, I've got an extra dip cube, that I don't really need for dip because dip is kind of pathetic, to tell you the truth, too. And I could use some more money. But you only did it for a war, right? You only activated your merchants because you're going to war or you had a huge debt or something like that. You had to have some good reason that you wanted to do it. Otherwise, actually passing might be a better move because it lets you hold that cube and maybe you can use it for something more valuable on another turn when you have better cards or something. Non-player realms. Okay. Let's swap batteries. Non-player realms in this game are almost entirely static. There's one exception, or there's a set of exceptions called dynamic non-player realms, which aren't very dynamic. In the original board game, non-player realms were static. Your minor powers that weren't played by someone, they wouldn't do anything unless an event told them to do something. It's plausible there are events that make something happen here. For the most part, that's not the case. I can't think of one that happened, but there might be. What there is here is dynamic non-player realms, which are marked with little hexagonal pieces, which are limited by countermix. So if the non-player realm wants to grow in one place and it's already grown to its maximum size, it leaves another place. Again, an abomination. Okay. But they're triggered to do little teeny things here and there. They never declare war on anyone. The most that they do is they slip a marker under your control marker, which means now they consider it their core province. So if you lose it, it becomes theirs. Like if you lose it to rebellion or something. And honestly, war with these miners, if you don't declare a war on a miner, the war with the miners is really represented by rebellion forces, which liberate everybody. And they don't necessarily conquer things. They return things to the person who has them as their core province, or to the power that has it as a core province. Now, if it's an NPR, it returns it to the NPR printed on the map. If it's a dynamic NPR, it returns it to the one that's put a claim on it. The computer game managed every single country as its own little entity and ran, they all had their own little AIs and did what they wanted to do. And you would see wars happening between other powers and everything, and you just sat back and you could just watch the game happen, take a nice little cozy spot and watch things happen in the game. And everybody would run themselves, and they would do a pretty good job. Obviously, that's going to be pretty hard in a board game. You would have to basically botify everything. There are bots. They're meant to replace players. So here it aligns fairly well with the original board game and not very well with the computer game. Rebels, like I said, there feels like there's a lot of unrest in this game. Part of it is because this game does something, and I don't know if the later computer games, I think they do, but the original board game did not really account for religion in a very believable fashion. Basically, states had a certain religion, and for the non-player states, they became all the Protestant ones basically became Protestant at once when Martin Luther nails his thingy up on the wall. His thingy. And player states had a little bit more capability to make choices as to their religion, but generally didn't want to choose ahistorically. There might be events that change the religion of something in the original game. I think the first two versions of the computer game followed that. I think the later versions started including religion as a real attribute, something that was malleable. This follows that kind of model. However, already it has the problem that there's a countermix limitation on that. I don't think there's anything like that in the computer game. I don't think there's if there's 16 or more provinces that are areas that are Protestant and counter-reform combined, or whatever the number is. There's a lot of those counters, but there can be no more, and something else will change back to its original religion if you do that. I'm pretty sure the computer game doesn't do that. I can't guarantee it because I have not played those versions very much. It certainly seems obscene to have that happen. What's nice about the religious model is that it's triggered by some of these sort of secondary events that come off the event cards, and it just spreads. And you can't guarantee what religions will end up where. And we ended up with very, very different, a very, very different map. One where Protestantism looked like it was going to take over everything. And then counter-reform came in late because Council of Trent didn't happen. And really only players were fighting to make things counter-reform. But it did trigger So both Protestantism and counter-reform would spread. Now they can't flip back and forth in the same turn, but you'd have like this muddling changes of religion there, which I find the religious model really, really cool. I really like what it does in this game. This is one of the things that I think is beautiful, except for that countermix limitation. As soon as I found out there was a countermix limitation, it really reduced my pleasure in the game, even though I didn't play with that. Even though I made the modification, it just disturbed the hell out of me. It wasn't the fact that I was using, alternate counters. I had a whole bunch of stuff that I was using to replace the religious markers. And there's weird shit with it, which is like, there's religious markers on the back of things that are not limited. There's just some really odd stuff with the alignment of the markers. I would say take that away, except for one thing that works very much like religion, which is the revolutionary ideology covers a religious marker. And the only way you can really uncover a religious marker, the only way that makes sense, is by expansion of the revolutionary ideology. It moves a revolutionary marker to another religion. Now, I found out after I had already started dealing with this, and 2 states had already become revolutionary ideology. This would be severely problematic, where people could strip those states of what is effectively their religion. And the same thing happens with the religions. If there's too many of a religion in play, probably not that big a deal with some, but like the Poles could put Catholicism in their areas. They could convert things to Catholic from Orthodox. Very good idea in general. And then somebody else could steal those Catholic markers and put them over Muslim areas. There's a limited number of Catholic markers. Likewise, you have this with Protestant and counter-reform, where a Protestant area could become Catholic or Muslim based on somebody pulling that counter off the board. Anyway. The event deck, I've already kind of touched on this. Like I said, it's pre-programmed by the scenario. You're expected to know the event deck as the players, or be able to know what's in it. Although there's no resources, like there's no compendium of what all the events are. So, but if you played the game a sufficient number of times, you might memorize what events are in the deck in a particular deck. I would much prefer to see the game handle some randomization to that. Again, early in the game, for the first half of the game or so, I was kind of excited about the idea of making up rules for generating a deck. Part of the problem with that is the national events are very fixed. What they do is not necessarily fixed. Oh, here's something that's very different. So, both the old board game, when you got a national event, you might get a choice as the player who's affected by it. In the computer game, when you're sitting there, you get a pop-up, and it tells you, hey, it's the Wars of Religion in France. Here's what's happening. Gives you some historical, and then tells you, here are your choices. In this game, you ain't necessarily the person who chooses, right? So, somebody else decides to activate the Turkish event, they can choose to force me to do something I don't want to do as the Turkish player. How do I feel about that? I got mixed feelings. It doesn't represent either the old board game or the computer game at all, but I kind of think it's cool from a gamey functionality. I think it's kind of neat to be able to force people down paths that they don't necessarily want to go. I like that. And also there's the possibility that nobody chooses the event, and it just doesn't happen. Because one event each round doesn't get chosen. its secondary events will take place, but the actual event doesn't. So there's cool shit with that that I actually really, really like how that operates. And I feel like that's where this game kind of, that's another thing, like the religion, where this game kind of shows some shine that I really, really like and would love, want to play around with. The victory points. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I had a widely disparate victory point situation in my game, but I'm going to say it's a hell of a lot more balanced than the original board game, and a hell of a lot more reasonable, and probably more balanced than the computer game as well. My understanding with the computer game was that, like, France just gets such a huge economy in it, and this may have changed over versions, but like up to the second edition. The computer game, France just could kind of run away with the game. They had so much such a big country that could achieve such wealth. They had access the events, etc. They had access to so many to exploration outside the European continent and to trade. Certainly in the board game, there are countries that are just shit. I mean, so there's a player, Portugal, Russia. You start out as Portugal, you play them for two eras, then you switch to Russia in the original game. Well, Portugal can do great. They can easily win those first two periods. In fact, things aren't particularly fair in those first two periods, and Portugal is one of the two people most likely to win them. But then they get Russia, and sure, Russia might even things out a little bit. Now, Russia just goes in the tank. It has a horrible chance, it basically has no chance to produce positive victory points. It's producing negative points throughout the game. And even worse, from my point of view, because I can kind of look at it and say, okay, fine, they didn't balance the victory points, whatever. We could fix that. But the way it's set up, the way the events, etc., hit it, Russia can never expand and fill what it did historically. It's impossible. So you don't get a historical map, and you don't get a fair game. With this, my feeling is where people didn't do well, they didn't do well due to some mismanagement or whatever. Although I do have some questions, because, for example, what countries did the best? Austria, Poland, Turkey. What countries didn't do so well? England, Spain, France. Now, we didn't see anywhere near enough exploration and colonization in the game. Also, Spain and Poland both failed to unify their countries as they did historically. Now, the unification I think I could manage. It's big. Swallowing something the size of Castile or Lithuania is really hard. But it's possible. It might not be worth it. However, the exploration stuff, I felt really handcuffed and had a very hard time getting away with that. In terms of like being able to gain stuff and keep my country in good shape. Basically, it's the equivalent of fighting a minor power every turn. You can do it if you've got good rulership and everything, and your country's fairly stable. You can get away with it. But if you've got any problems, like there's religion happening, you're going to have a hard time. So it may be that the colonization powers have a hard time getting the points that they're expected to have. That could probably be tweaked. One of the things that I think you can tweak the game with, I found very late in the game there was a card that handed out a bunch of cubes to other players, to everybody. I think maybe if you just gave a few more cubes out to everybody, you would generate enough fat that people would fight wars, and they would fight the wars that they historically did more, and they would explore more. And it would also make it so that this tended to be longer, that there were more actions in each turn. So playing cards for actions can be expensive and whatever, but it eats up your cubes, is what I mean by expensive, and it lets you pass quicker. The things like not diplomacy. Diplomacy can eat up your cubes real fast. Exploration, trade, and military campaigns might use your cubes very slowly. Military campaigns can use up a lot when you're sieging, but when you're actually attacking, you basically spend 1 cube to move an army, or to move a navy, or to do a naval move, which might move an army. And you run through those cubes very slowly. Curing Unrest eats up your military cubes like that. It's just, you can throw them all down, cure your unrest. A lot of the other things that you can do, things like improving your stability, eat up a lot of cubes all at once. So somebody who has a lot of unrest in their area, or somebody who has too few cubes, is going to make the turns really, really short. So that people who have a lot of cubes, who want to do military, who want to do exploration, who want to do trade, who want to do this stuff, they don't have the time to do it all. And they're able to only maybe conquer one area because siege is also fast for some reason. Basically, that doesn't seem at all reasonable to me. Siege should be the slow part of this. Of course, you're looking at 20-year turns, so each action, you're probably looking at 5 actions or something, 4 actions, say. Each action is like a 5-year turn, the original full length of, a turn in the old EU. So, yeah, you should be able to conquer an entire area during that. You should be able to have multiple wars during that, like declare a war and have peace and whatnot, if you're going to have 20-year terms. In fact, the concept of war may not make much sense. I skipped over something, which is peace resolution. This game has an interesting peace resolution mechanism. I haven't fully, grokked it to the extent that I can speak on it absolutely, but you're forced into peace if the enemy has an army and you don't. This is a little odd, and I don't like how this works. So, at the end of a turn, at the end of this 20-year arbitrary period, if your army happens to have been wiped out and you didn't get a chance to build another one, probably due to money, might be due to lack of cubes, might be due to, oops, somebody ended the turn on me in a bad position, you're in a position where you have to surrender. And you have to take whatever the victor's demands are. Now, the victor is only allowed to demand based on what they gained from you. And then there's also the possibility, though, for negotiation. One of the things with the military situation, we had, the game ended with a war between Austria and Poland and Turkey and Poland, 2 wars. And Poland surrendered voluntarily in both, because victory point wise, it was to their advantage to give up all that territory on the last turn of the game. They probably wouldn't have done that earlier in the game, though. We did not see negotiated peaces happen very much. But you're allowed to basically negotiate a peace. And this is something you're not allowed to do in the original EU, and I don't think you're allowed to do in the computer game. You're allowed to negotiate a peace based on the leverage that both players kind of don't want the war to continue past this arbitrary point. Now, there's some fucked up shit, again, having to do with the turn ordering and whatnot, and how diplomacy works. There's no diplomacy once you're in war. right? So once you're involved in a war, you usually can't do any of your diplomatic actions. So you end up delaying going to war for a long time. You might also gain an advantage on your opponent because they use up their cubes. There's a danger to this. It feels gamey anyway, so I don't mind that the fact that you're delaying the other guy's ability to prosecute a war might cause you to lose your chance to do the war. But it is just a natural thing. The game sort of forces you to think in these terms and to say, well, I'm going to make him use up his resources. Because you don't want to fight him on even terms. And you might get the best out of it by delaying the war. But the fact that there's like this artificial turn constraint where at the end of the turn you do actually pay a pretty big price in terms of your economics, in terms of in terms of victory points, in terms of stability, you pay a price for being at war still. Now, this is true in the original game as well. In the original game, you paid a stability cost for being at war at the end of the turn. But generally, there were enough military phases to fight out most wars completely. There was no gamey end to the turns. Now and then, they ended, and presumably it was due to bad weather. And the idea was that the armies weren't able to operate as much. The weather was bad enough that there weren't enough campaign seasons. But in general, you had 6 or 7 military-only operations that you could undertake. And if you had a lot of money, you could undertake unlimited military operations during one of those phases. Right? It costs you $100, it only costs you 10 to move one military operation. So you tended to not spend the 100. But if you had a lot to do, if you wanted to get your war, you wanted to get a big advantage out of the war, you spent your 100 and you move into a lot of areas at once. Usually didn't make sense though. Anyway, I do like the way the peace system seems to work here, but I haven't explored it fully. Special rules for the HRE. The HRE, Holy Roman Empire, is allowed to grow. Well, it's allowed to shrink and then regain territories. I wish it were allowed to actually grow. I feel like the only condition under which it should be allowed to grow is Imperial Authority 6. And that would require new counters to indicate new Holy Roman Empire spaces. This is a really nice little mechanism. I really like how this, and honestly how the Papal Curia work in this game. These are two things the Curia is managed here. It's just, you get some cubes on here, you get a little bit of advantage, you get the capability to excommunicate someone if you want to, or declare a crusade. Those tend to be expensive and painful things. The big advantage is gaining some extra cubes and gaining some victory points. The actual actions probably aren't worth that much. The Holy Roman Empire, boy, they have a lot of neat capabilities. First of all, if you get the prestige up high, you get a bunch of extra cubes. You might get some prestige off of it. You get to control some extra cubes that are on the board, that are diplomatic influence cubes. Those can be really, really powerful. I didn't tend to use them for much, but yeah, they can be very valuable. You're not ever allowed to spend those cubes, though. But they can give you some sort of political power that gives you an advantage over other players without having to throw your own cubes on the board. You're also allowed to defend the Holy Roman Empire, and you're allowed to call on it to defend you as the emperor if you're attacked. And you pull, it has a fair amount of troops equal to the amount of power you have in it, that you can just deploy for free. I believe they deploy. I don't even know if you have to do a military deployment for them. I think you do because there's a space there for them. Oh no! They don't deploy actually. No, they sit in this space and they defend imperial spaces, areas within the Holy Roman Empire, with their strength, in addition to whatever troops are there and whatever. So yeah, that's a really, really powerful advantage. It becomes very difficult to fight wars against somebody in the empire. You don't want to declare war against imperial countries, powers. Now, obviously, fighting Austria over Hungary and the Balkans, that's fine, because the Imperials aren't going to help you there. They have rules on player elimination. It's basically not player elimination, it's player quitting. If somebody needs to leave, they've got rules on how to convert them over to a bot or otherwise handle them if you don't want to do bots. I really wish there was player elimination, because there are rules in place that prevent you from taking out a nation. And somebody begins the game as Poland, and Poland historically was destroyed in the period of this game. Likewise, I would say the Netherlands should be able to be destroyed if they're a nation. Other nations should be able to. Why not? And you let somebody come in as another nation. Again, would require some rules to be changed to do that. All right, overall, how do I feel? God, I don't know. All right, one last battery. Look, I enjoyed playing. I enjoyed it the way I would not enjoy a big Euro, right? You know, I call this the biggest Euro that I've seen. I enjoy this so much more to play than I would enjoy playing, you know, most any of the larger, heavier Euros. Even though a lot of the play mechanisms feel Euro-ish to me, feel designed to create interactive play, create lots of important decision points and all that shit that I don't like, right? I do get a kick out of this. I think as a game, it is really cool. The scope of the game gives you a story that you really, really, that is really compelling. The things that I want to fix, I'm less certain that I can fix or that are worth fixing. Like, I want to make it into this perfect, beautiful thing, right? Obviously, I can't do that, but, you know, I'm not that good. But I want to make it suit my needs better. A few things, right? I'd love to throw more cubes in the game to give a little bit more fat to the countries so they can do more. Randomize the event deck. Put a couple more players in the game. Sweden, Denmark, Sweden, which switch over, Russia. Have players programmed to leave certain countries and join others, so that Portugal would switch to Russia maybe, or something along those lines. This is all stuff that I could do. The reason I kind of don't want to is that I'm just sort of, there's a couple of things that just grate on me so fucking much. Okay, countermix limitations. Hey, I worked my way around them without even actually deciding to do so. So I think that's one that I would get rid of, right? Without any problem. And then the one thing that I'm left with that bugs the shit out of me is the existence of the cubes. The very existence of them. That is the one thing that just makes it so damn hard for me to accept and understand. And I think I'm willing to take them on, the same way I'm willing to take on, you know, CDG cards, right? And coin card flips and stuff like that. However, they're enough to make it so that I'm not absolutely gung-ho enough that I want to start replaying and trying to fiddle around with it right away, which probably means I don't get around to it. And there's some discussion about if they put out new player sets and especially if they put out rules to go with those player sets, not new rules, new scenarios that fill those player sets out, fill the event deck out. Oh, we didn't even talk about power struggles. Add power struggles, which are basically victory point goal sets that everybody has to play for, and that might penalize you. If they were to throw something that worked the mechanisms in so that you could have more than 6 players and have more power plays than the game actually supports currently. Have more events than the game actually supports currently. I think I would. I think I would fiddle around with it. The thing, before somebody started saying, hey, they're considering putting out new colors. Before they did that, I was considering building my own, extra player and just throw Russia in. But there's problems with it. It's not that trivial. It's like everything else. You kind of have to tinker with things. And I don't think Russia's the country that I would throw in. I think I'd throw in Denmark and I'd throw in Portugal to begin with. And I'd make rules for transitioning. Now, if they were willing to go to that extent, wow, that would be beautiful. But I don't expect them to try to make the old EU-style game out of this, where it's got that handoff of power and whatever. Yeah. Who is this going to appeal to? Well, again, wargamers are going to have a problem with the abstraction of the military, especially the Napoleonic Wars. The time scale is so huge that you can't have the details of the military in it and have them operate properly. Most Euro gamers probably aren't up for something this size. Yeah, I know the modern Euro has gotten super big and heavy. But when we're talking super big and heavy, we're talking like maybe 6 hours, maybe, I don't know. They usually get pretty cranky about things that take too long. To play the grand campaign of this is a decently large game. You can see by the amount of time that I spent playing. I don't think it's as big as the original board game was, despite me putting more video into it. But yeah, it's a decent sized game. It's not something you sit down and play in one session. But there are scenarios you could play in one session. And I had fun even with the introductory scenario. So, and the game gives you hints as to how to construct your own, not just hints. It gives you a system as to how to construct your own scenario. What it doesn't really give you is, it doesn't give you the historical knowledge to be able to do that correctly. And there are certain core mechanisms to the game that prevent it. That you'd have to break those core mechanisms and go against this. You'd have to devise your deck slightly differently than these are devised to be able to create like an 8-player scenario or whatever. But if they just put out the pieces, I'd take a crack at it, man. I'd take a crack at it. Because I think there's some really beautiful stuff in this game that I took a great deal of pleasure. I know 90% of what I was saying while I was playing it was bitching about this damn fucking cubes. So much of a Euro. But you know what? It does a lot. It does something really interesting. It does not adequately portray the computer game. It misses in a few things. There are things that I would like to change that I don't think I could, like the trade system. I think the trade system's just there, and you got to deal with it. I much prefer the original game's trade system, where you're worrying about trying to get monopolies in products, to control their prices, to get victory points for the monopolies, which seems a little weird, but you also get money for them. But I would much rather you controlled the prices through the monopolies, but whatever. It works okay. And to control to have it just come in as income. You could probably do that with some sort of, okay, deal out some trade cards or something, or make some whole new economic system. But I just feel like that's ripping too deep into, how the game was designed. It would be like trying to make it into a spreadsheet first, then military game, and just make it the old EU on a different, on a simpler board and everything. And I don't want to do that. I can play with the old EU and fiddle around with that to try to make it work better towards other things. There are some things this really shines at. And it's also not at the level of detail of the old EU. And I find that appealing as well, in its own sort of way. To get this kind of scope and almost believable history, right? Where does it go wrong? Look, you're not allowed to eliminate Poland. That's the first thing. There's an edge of the map because Russia's not in the game. The numbers don't quite work right for exploration and colonization. At least I couldn't get them to. Whatever. But yeah, I think they did a beautiful job of putting something there. I think it's flawed in my estimation in a few ways, but most of them could be tinkered with. So we'll see. We'll see.